Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Ribbentrop. I am a licensed clinical social worker, certified family trauma professional, and EMDR trained clinician. I am the owner and primary psychotherapist at Live Free Psychotherapy based in Boca Raton, Florida. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I have a presentation here titled Breaking the Cycle, Intergenerational Trauma and Personality. We'll learn more about that for sure as we go along. The event today, very appreciative, sponsored by Foundations Recovery Network. They're helping us to put this on for everybody. And as we move forward, you'll have options at the end to do a Q&A. You can submit a question on the bottom left of your screen at any point during the presentation. All questions will be answered during the last 10 minutes of the program. Resources are available. You'll be able to find a PDF of the presentation and additional resources under the headshot image located on the left of your screen. For any assistance, please email Melissa Pangaro at mpangaro@naccme.com. You can find that with the resources as well, I believe. For credit information, to receive credit, you must watch the program all the way through the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. Please do not leave the console at any time. Please continue to stay on the platform and you will be automatically redirected to an evaluation landing page. If this is your first time attending a webinar in 2019, you will need to create a NACCME account. When you are first directed to the landing page for all subsequent webinars you attend, you will already have an account and you'll just need to log in. After completion of the evaluation, you'll be able to download or print your certificate. And NAADAC credit is only offered for the live broadcast. So with all of that, let's get right to it. As noted, we're talking about, by the name of the title there, we're talking about intergenerational trauma and personality disorders. And we're also going to be connecting that a little bit to the treatment of substance use disorders. So to start us off, what does this mean? My general synopsis here is an effort to understand the degree to which coping strategies developed in response to abuse and trauma are passed from generation to generation, unintentionally perpetuating self-destructive and maladaptive patterns of being in the world that ultimately impact self, others, and subsequent generations. And a little bit of background on kind of the idea for this presentation, and we'll get a little bit more into some of what I just described as well. But, you know, I've been fortunate throughout my career thus far to have been able to work with some very, very talented clinicians and directors that have supported my clinical growth and sort of directed me a little bit in this direction, where I've been able to do some work in the fields of trauma, substance use disorders, and family systems. And it was speaking to a colleague, she and I were able to talk a little bit about how our own personal family backgrounds have influenced some of our lives and where we are today, that this idea really kind of came to light, and I was able to kind of combine it with a desire to better understand what we mean when we talk about things like addiction is a family disease, or you see treatment centers say a lot of the time we treat underlying issues. You know, these are terms or phrases that are sort of thrown around. I guess I've been curious to gain a more thorough understanding again of sort of what is meant by that. Why do we encounter some of the things we encounter in the clinical settings, and what is really, really going on underneath the surface for folks when we have acute presentations of mental illness, substance use disorders, things like that, sort of the proverbial tip of the iceberg. And to effectively treat it, I see more and more that it really is about getting under the surface and digging deeper. So as we move forward, hopefully a better understanding of some of those factors will emerge for us. To sort of get us rolling a little bit here, Going to go over some basic working definitions to sort of serve us through the presentation. Starting off, the term trauma has really emerged and is used very, very often nowadays. At this point, I've yet to find a single definition that really encompasses everything that sort of falls under the trauma umbrella. And that's what I'm saying here is that the symptoms are so broad as to cover most or a majority of mental health issues. As such, it's difficult to properly define, and I would say trends toward subjective clinical understanding and interpretation. We can break trauma, quote unquote, down into three primary lenses. There's acute trauma, which is maybe our most generally or best understood form of trauma. That's commonly linked to a sort of clear-cut or more black and white definition of PTSD. Acute trauma is something like a car accident where somebody gets into a wreck, and then we're going to see symptoms where maybe they have a tough time driving, maybe they have some flashbacks, maybe they are triggered driving past the scene of the car crash, etc. Moving down the line a little bit, we fall into chronic trauma. And there we have an example of repeated and prolonged abuse or trauma, and domestic violence, I think, is a decent example of that, where you have essentially a series of acute traumatic experiences to varying degrees occurring over a prolonged period of time. I think maybe what we're going to look at sort of the most as we move on in the presentation, and what I am generally most mindful of in the work that I do is what's considered complex trauma. And here we have noted exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature. And that interpersonal nature component is important. A lot of times within family systems, this stuff is implicit. Trauma, quote unquote, is not always as clear cut as somebody gets into a car crash or a veteran returning from overseas experiencing some of the challenges faced in a war zone, for example. A lot of times when we have some of this stuff, especially within generations, there's a lack of awareness around how significant some of the boundary violations are that occur within a family system. So we'll definitely kind of dig in and bounce around some of these definitions moving forward, and hopefully everybody will gain a little bit better understanding as well. Moving on, we have definition here, intergenerational / transgenerational trauma. These are two different things. Intergenerational, we see, right, F0 to F1. So what we're saying is that generation, right, from generation. So there's not a gap, right? So we have a mom and a dad passing to their children. Transgenerational is when we're referring to something that basically skips a generation. So we have maybe symptoms or presentations from grandma and grandpa that are showing up in grandchildren. So sometimes you'll talk to a family and a parent will say, gosh, they're so much like my mother, right, their grandmother. That's an example of transgenerational. And I think it's a helpful and interesting difference there. Super important to remain mindful of here. Trauma can be transmitted through physiological, environmental, and social pathways. Again, like a part of this presentation, a part of what we're talking about here is the degree to which what we see in a clinical setting results in a combination of factors and an interplay of factors So again, making an effort to move away from a mindset or a mode of practice where we're viewing trauma as a single incident or a single set of incidents. We want to view it a bit more as something that results from an interconnectedness of factors and variables. And a large part of that is connected to these generational themes. I think there's further sort of validity to looking at how trauma or intergenerational trauma can parallel some of our understanding of heredity and hereditary components. So, right, we don't have a big issue sort of understanding that, you know, if mom and dad have brown eyes, there's a likelihood that the child will have brown eyes. You know, there's not a direct comparison there, but there is a parallel in terms of how certain coping mechanisms, certain patterns of interpersonal connection, certain patterns of emotional response are transmitted. And we're going to break that down again a little bit more as we move forward. Moving on with some of our definitions here. Personality disorder, I have mental here in the definition in quotation marks. And again, what I want to do there, I guess, or you know, sort of note is you know, that we're talking about something that is connected to a multitude of factors. So mental health is not in and of itself related to the brain, right? We know at this point with relative clarity that mental health issues, quote unquote, are really connected to, right, physical, social, environmental factors. The list can go really sort of on and on. Furthermore, right, we kind of break it down a bit more. We say that the personality disorder consists of maladaptive patterns of thought, emotional response, and behavior, difficulty in the development or maintenance of a cohesive sense of self, others, and the world. And mention here that traits may be disordered, again in quotes, but not constitute a diagnosis, and that traits exist along the spectrum. And part of what we're talking about here is connecting personality disorders and personality disordered traits or characteristics to maladaptive survival mechanisms. So, right, somebody is going to inherently have a difficult time developing a cohesive sense of self, right, when they've inherited or developed modes of coping, right, that don't accurately reflect their environment. So if we're running on survival mechanisms based in traumatic or complex traumatic response, we're not going to be effectively focused on developing meaningful interpersonal connections or responding appropriately to emotional stressors. We're going to be a lot more on the reactive end of the spectrum, or we're going to be inheriting reactive coping strategies and mechanisms. I also want to note that traits, again, derive from survival mechanisms. You know, we're all capable of moving in the direction of a personality disordered trait, characteristic, or collection of qualities and characteristics that then result in what can be a full-blown disorder. And, you know, it then becomes about these sort of environmental cues, experiences, that interplay of factors that we mentioned above. And you're also going to want to keep in mind that there does seem to be some temperamental predisposition. So we're never really moving far away from the recognition that there is an interplay of components and perspectives to be aware of as we're doing an assessment and as we're working with individuals or couples or family systems. Again, sort of circling back to the concept of maladaptive, I like that a lot more than good or bad or positive or negative. I think, right, we do want to be mindful that when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about survival. We're talking about deeply embedded mechanisms that serve to keep us alive. And so when we're talking about something that's maladaptive, at some point, right, that was something that was serving a very, very important purpose for us. And when we're beginning to see it in a clinical setting, that's when it's begun to perhaps backfire in some ways. But it's linked to a survival component, and that makes it that much more difficult at times to break up and move away from for an individual. So definitely keeping that in mind, right? We have a lot of folks talk about how difficult it is to treat personality disorders, certain personality disorders or traits especially, right? So you hear very often the difficulties with cluster B or borderline. Yes, for sure, very challenging. Those are defense mechanisms that are meant to be very challenging, and they're meant to be challenging for a purpose. And again, it's because it's connected to a very, very deep, very, very powerful survival mechanism of drive. I wanted to throw in as well, when we're talking about personality and when we're talking about family, there's a deep historical context that our understanding of these things or these areas of study comes from. So when we look at personality, we're looking at a combination, again, there's that interplay of characteristics or qualities that form an individual's distinctive character. And we can break up even some of the words in that definition and further hone in on better defining some of that as well, for sure. But the idea of personality, I find this very interesting. I find it informative, and I think it grounds some of our work, again, in a historical context. But we're looking at a concept and field of study that's over 2,000 years old. And you see examples of people making an effort to better understand human beings, right, continue throughout Western and Eastern intellectual traditions for 2,000 years plus. In the present, when we're looking at a study of personality, we're taking into consideration disciplines ranging from, as noted here, right, biology, genetics, social and cultural studies, psychology, philosophy, neuroscience. We could go on and on. It's really amazing when you start doing just a little bit of digging, how much information there is out there on these ideas. Super interesting. I encourage folks to, if they ever have time or the luxury to do so, take a look, do a Google search or whatever it is. So again, going into a little bit of background here, and again, to ground us a little bit, and really just because it's interesting, I think, this is nothing new. Thematic elements of both are cross-cultural and historical. And we can look to Hippocrates. He was a physician and thinker in classical Greece. If anybody is familiar with the Hippocratic Oath, that is this guy. And he is credited with one of the first efforts to categorize human personality. And he developed a set of characteristics and qualities very similar to how we categorize personality disorders today. And that was the start of a more formal effort to understand how humans function. It's interesting here, we've definitely taken on some of the language that was used then. Melancholic is rooted in Greek, and we still use that as a description for sadness or depressive characteristics or qualities. Moving forward a little bit, another physician, Galen, I believe he was Greek, but during the time of the ancient Romans, and he took on some of the work that Hippocrates did in terms of understanding of personality, characteristics, and traits, and he expanded upon Hippocrates' work. I find this interesting as well, and thought it worthy of sharing, really to highlight also that this stuff is cross-cultural and has carried through with time as well. Because if we fast forward 1,000 years from Hippocrates and Galen, we land on Avicenna. He was a Persian polymath, which means he studied just about everything. He was a physician as well. And he ultimately inherited some of the work of the ancient Greeks and Romans and further expanded upon that in ancient Persia. So again, highlighting the cross-cultural element of our sort of fundamental efforts to want to better understand ourselves as humans and how we operate in the world. If we move over to some Eastern traditions, you can definitely find some examples of intergenerational themes and understandings. So for example, when you look at a Buddhist concept of karma, right, we're talking about how one's past life informs, right, their present and their future. So right there, very clearly, right, there's an understanding that's very old in terms of how, right, there's the interplay of generations and time, and that we're not just these individuals operating without context or in a vacuum. You can also very much look to Confucian history and understanding that's deeply focused on an understanding of the family and family systems, and there's a fundamental belief there in the concept of filial piety or faith to one's family. So again, just really want to reiterate over and over here the interplay and interconnection theme, both in the way that we understand these topics and how we have historically understood these topics. That it's not just a recent emergence that is in the DSM-5. These are ideas and modes of understanding that have existed for a very long time. Our modern studies, again, ranges from, here I say genetics research to philosophical considerations, and we're hitting on everything in between. Psychological perspectives, we saw some of those emerging in the late 1800s, but the majority really coming to light as a consequence of the work of Freud and building from there in the 20th century. So that concludes our history lesson for the day, and we're going to merge back now into a bit more targeted understanding of personality disorders and intergenerational trauma. So as we move on, I find this a super helpful little diagram, image, whatever, in terms of helping me with a quick reference point. Our modern or our current DSM-informed understanding of personality disorders, we have 3 clusters. I'm not going to sort of bore everybody by going over this point by point, but we have 3 clusters. They are broadly categorized as odd behavior in cluster A. We have the quote-unquote dramatic cluster B and the anxious cluster C. There was some debate I saw prior to the release of the DSM-5 of really retooling this whole mode of diagnosis and categorization. So we certainly want to acknowledge that this is not a one-size-fits-all structure. And I think we need to be, or it serves us to be aware that we can have a lot of interplay again between these personality characteristics and traits and disorders. there's a lot of sort of called comorbidity and interplay between the clusters and between the specific disorders as well. I think there are definitely some that will maybe make an argument that a strong borderline is not going to have anything going on in the cluster A or cluster C area. I would tend to not be that black and white. I think that this sort of diagram and this mode of thinking, where it's most helpful in my practice, is in terms of informing, right, some more information about where we need to be interested in our family system, and also it helps to inform us very much on treatment modalities and areas of focus moving forward. So, for example, one of the things that I was sort of taught or that I learned was if you got somebody with some strong antisocial stuff going on, right, maybe they're reactive, maybe they're dysregulated, right, but probably good not to put them in a DBT program, because then we're equipping someone with antisocial qualities with better emotional regulation skills and interpersonal efficacy, rather than empathy development and understanding and practicing management of emotions based on boundaries and consequences. So, right, and that's open for debate, right? Not everybody's going to agree with that perspective, but it is an example of where well-intentioned interventions or modes of treatment may actually set us back. So again, using the personality disorder structure as a way to inform effective treatment measures and to give us some direction on where to look in our family systems, right? I think we'll see it a little bit later, but there's oftentimes a high level of heritability when we're talking about personality disorders. So somebody with borderline personality, right, there's like a 5 times heritability level. That if a parent has that disorder, quote unquote, that, right, 5 times more likely that a child is gonna have that or have qualities or characteristics. I wanted to be sure to mention some of I guess we could call it neuroscience that goes into our understanding of trauma, and this is an area of study. I would probably say this and genetics are two of the biggest areas of study where there is a tremendous opportunity for growth in terms of our understanding. But we've certainly seen growth in the neuroscience realm. You can do a very quick Google search, impact of trauma on the brain, and you will find a multitude of images that provide us with some clear-cut, objective evidence of how the brain is impacted by a traumatic experience. And what we're talking about here, or what I've made note of here, are a couple of points. One is that this HPA axis is our central stress response system. And that, and very broadly speaking, that's what's activated during a traumatic experience. And if we move on a little bit here, right, our sympathetic nervous system is then activated as well, or in connection to that HPA axis. And many of you are familiar, right, that prepares us on a physiological level for a fight, flight, or freeze response. And the reason, again, that that's important is that when we're talking about the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal glands or areas of the brain, right, and we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, we're talking about areas of the brain that are very, very, very old. They're in the back of our brain, close to our brain stem. We see HPA axis and sympathetic nervous systems in organisms, much less developed than we are. Again, these are deeply embedded mechanisms of survival. And this is what gets triggered when we're talking about trauma. And when we're talking about complex trauma, chronic trauma, acute trauma, we're talking about these systems not being deactivated at any point. So what you end up seeing, right, is somebody running on a chronic level of stress response. And we'll see in the slides below what that looks like in some ways. But again, right, the stress response is activated, and then it's not deactivated. And I think that a lot of the personality disorder traits and characteristics derive from those survival mechanisms being triggered, right? So avoidance, right, is a nuanced form of flight and freeze, right? When we look at our cluster B traits and characteristics, right, antisocial, histrionic, borderline, right, I think we can make a decent connection, right, or argument that they're derivative of or they derive from our fight mechanisms, right? These are very reactive personality traits and characteristics that keep people away. Same thing when we're looking at cluster A, right? I put that more in the sort of freeze category, right? But deeply, a deep difficulty in terms of interpersonal connection, a lot of times connected to some of the complex trauma that I made mention of earlier, where there are interpersonal boundary violations and deep suspicion of connection to others. That's something that feels very unsafe to some of those folks. It can be very challenging to treat. It's very difficult inherently, again, because there's that hesitance to connect on an interpersonal level. But again, I want to just, consistently remain mindful that we are dealing with survival. We're seeing it in the clinical setting because at this point it's maladaptive and it's backfiring, right? But it served a purpose at one point. And it served a really, really important purpose. And maybe that was generations ago, but it's still showing up for a reason. I included this slide here as again sort of a nod or an acknowledgement of what I made mention of, I think, in one of the first slides, where we have, and I can go between slides 14 and 15 here, we have such a variety of potential responses to trauma that to give a clear-cut definition of this is what it is, this is what it isn't, for me is nearly impossible. I do think that when we look down this list, right, and we're seeing maybe collections of some of these responses, right, these are our indications that we need to do some more digging, right? It is very, very difficult if we are trying to treat avoidance of event reminders, social relationship disturbances, decreased activity level, right? If we're trying to treat all of those individually, very, very difficult, right? If we notice, right, that a person is presenting with a collection of some of these characteristics or behavioral patterns or cognitive patterns, right? If we notice they're presenting with that, okay, now we want to be curious more about, well, where is that coming from? Where did you first have a hard time making decisions? Where did you first start to blame yourself? Where did you first have a hard time keeping certain memories out of your mind, even though you didn't want to be thinking about them? Those are our cues, okay? And those are also going to be some of the things that activate the maladaptive coping mechanisms that are personality disorders, right? So a person attempts to deal with the intrusive memories, okay, by acting out, by avoidance, by depending on others to take care of basic needs. So we have, again, a connection between the maladaptive coping mechanisms that combine into the personality features, right, based on some of these more clear-cut symptoms that may be present for somebody. It's also going to help inform us in terms of where we want to look with the family. Okay, so again, if we're seeing somebody that is emotionally reactive and acting out all over the place, and we find out that's due to, or it's a means of coping with intrusive memories or flashbacks, okay, well, now we know that there's a high probability that there's some cluster B stuff going on in the family of origin. So where is there potentially abuse or trauma in primary caretakers or parents? How do we help to maybe treat family members if they're willing to be involved in the treatment process? And how do we use that understanding to further support our work with the identified client or patient? So making an effort there to connect some of the dots between, right, intergenerational trauma, complex trauma, and connecting to some of the more clear-cut symptoms that may be at first present when we're starting to work with somebody. Moving forward, I was fortunate to find a lot of really helpful material when doing research for this, and it definitely helped to inform some of the definitions that I was able to develop and come up with here as well. But one of the ideas that we return to again and again here is that when trauma has not been addressed or adequately treated in parents or caregivers, there may occur a transmission of traumatic response and coping styles to the next generation. Okay? And that's going to be via patterns of attachment. For those familiar with attachment theory, super relevant, by the way, when we're talking about complex trauma related to adoption, family separation, things like that. Definitely relevant nowadays in terms of the opioid epidemic and how we got sort of a generation of youngsters now growing up without a mom or a dad due to that. So attachment, caretaking, implicit or explicit messages about the world, safety, self, and others. If you get a message from mom saying, be careful every time you leave the house, maybe it doesn't add up to anything. Maybe it does add up to believing that every time you leave the house, it's unsafe. So that's an extreme example, and it's a little bit silly, but it works because small messages over time add up. So be careful, right, every time you leave the house is very different than have a good time, enjoy yourself, say hello to so-and-so. Okay, those are two very different types of messages, and over time can result in very different ways of engaging with the world depending on how they're internalized. To do a quick kind of example or case study of some of what I've been speaking about here, let's say that you have a parent come into you for a session and they say, I'm having a terrible time controlling my adolescent. So first of all, I don't know about anybody listening, but I've never had any success supporting anybody controlling an adolescent. Adolescents are difficult because they can't be controlled. So that's, red flag number one. So you have your client come in, I'm having a hard time controlling my adolescent. they're acting out all over the place, they're doing drugs, they're disrespectful, et cetera, et cetera. And this person's angry and upset about this. They can't believe their adolescent is acting out in this way. And so you say, wow, I'm so sorry to hear that. Tell them maybe you get a little bit of wiggle room and you learn a little bit about the parent, right? And you do a little bit of work to develop some rapport, move away from some of the crisis around the adolescent, and you learn that there's a history of sexual abuse in the family, okay? And now maybe we have a better understanding about why, okay, we're so reactive and upset and maybe hyper-focused on our acting out adolescent, okay? So we realize that in some ways perhaps it's easier for our parent to be hyper-focused on the acting out adolescent rather than have to address some of the sexual abuse history in their own background or their own family, okay? Or have to do some work on those personality features and characteristics that developed as a result of that abuse history, okay? So it's much easier for me, right, if I'm a parent, to come in and talk about my adolescent acting out, right? I can bank on my adolescent acting out, and I can be angry about it. And that's going to be an easier means of attempting to regulate uncomfortable emotions in comparison to maybe having to look at some of the own pain that one has experienced in their background, okay? That's also when you're getting into a need to understand that sometimes, right, there is consciously or unconsciously a benefit to having a child, for example, acting out or having a tough time, okay? So you may very well run into these situations where your efforts to support a child are being undermined by the family. Maybe that's conscious, maybe it's unconscious, right? But again, it's happening for a reason. So if you're not feeling supported, right, in your efforts to support a child in doing some of their work, or an adult in doing some recovery, if you're feeling undermined by the family, red flag, right? And we need to then begin to look at, well, what's the motivation for that? What's the buy-in for keeping so-and-so stuff? Very, very important. Happens a lot in substance abuse treatment, because in substance abuse treatment, you're getting the person where the family's stuff has come to a head, right? You're getting the tip of the iceberg, okay? And that's the starting point, okay? The acute issues bringing that person into treatment, that's scratching the surface. That's the starting point of the work. But it's going to begin, if you look at that surface level stuff, that's going to begin to inform the rest of your work with that individual and that family system. I'm moving forward here a little bit. I love this graphic. I think it does a phenomenal job of connecting how deeply that interplay of factors can emerge. And this is from a study on how national and historical factors can impact families and individuals. And what you see is a nation that experiences loss of collective identity, genocide, and they trace it down to community level, family level, how the family copes with the community and national issues, the impact of that on the individual. This study does make reference to epigenetics and the HPA axis, which we noted above. Epigenetics is about certain genes being turned on and off in one's lifetime. The connection to trauma is still very much being studied, but definitely could be of interest once we know a little bit more. And so we move into the individual impact and then how that cycles back all the way up to a national level. And you can definitely find examples of this when you're looking at, let's say, geopolitical studies of how civil war and warfare has impacted countries for generation upon generation, centuries, really, where there's this cycle that continues and is very, very difficult for folks to break out of. Again, connected to how do we respond when our survival mechanisms are constantly being triggered or have not been untriggered at any point. Again, and we can find some of the resources in the slides here, and they'll be provided, I believe, as well. But I want to go over a couple ideas around generational transmission. I think these are great examples of how complex trauma can be inherited or passed along. I especially appreciate the point where we're noting the intuitive responsibility assumed by children to compensate in various ways for their parents' suffering. We know anecdotally, generally speaking, that kids are like sponges. Again, anecdotally, I think we could argue that many children can absorb, in a sense, the energy of those around them. And as children, right, we are entirely dependent on the adults in our lives for our survival. So if we're picking up on a parent or a caretaker not being okay, right, there's a part of a child that's going to be motivated to try and make that caretaker okay, because the child's okayness depends on the caretaker's okayness. And that's an example of some, early emergence of caretaking qualities and characteristics that you definitely see show up in adulthood. And an example of that is, you have a caretaking mom who's making excuses for their child that's acting out all over the place, okay? And so, well, what's that about? Why are we so inclined to make excuses for the child's behavior? Okay, why are we so inclined to, sort of make okay, not okay behavior for this kid? So, right, again, red flag, where does this come from? And maybe we do some digging, and maybe that's an example where, this mom as a kid was tasked with having to go get dad from the bar every night, right? So as a child, was taking on responsibility for getting dad from the bar, making sure that dad got home every night, right? There's the beginning of an inappropriate level of responsibility, an inappropriate level of having to take care of the adult in one's life, right? Being in this sort of double bind where maybe a person at some point wants to say something, maybe they want to do something different, okay? But there's that deep connection and dependence on wanting to make the parent or caretaker okay. And so we see maybe the result of that in enabling behavior with that person's child. Okay? And so again, right, it becomes less about talking to the mom about stop enabling your kid, and it becomes more about healing and addressing some of those ACOA characteristics or qualities that are showing up, where maybe mom was playing this surrogate spousal role, right, this parental role as a child, and now it's having an impact on her child, right? We're allowing too much to go by. We're not putting in appropriate boundaries and consequences because we haven't gotten over what we had to do growing up as kids. So just kind of, riffing and making, an effort to share maybe a made-up kind of case study that illustrates some of these points. Again, want to make mention of how varied these symptoms can be, and really any kind of acute symptom that shows up, make an effort to sort of gather together what you're seeing, right? And that's when the curiosity is really, really helpful in terms of where does that come from? What does that do? Where did you learn that? What was mom like? What was dad like? What is your family like? What are your caretakers like? Were you adopted? Those are, right? We need to go back because those are critical areas of focus if we're going to get beyond the alleviation of symptoms. And ideally, in our work, we do want to go beyond the alleviation of symptoms, right? Because if we don't get beyond that, then there are going to be more symptoms. It's going to continue. You see that in the addiction field all the time, okay? Is that somebody comes in and they stop using, and a month down the road they're active in an eating disorder, which was present before the substance use disorder, right? So if we're not getting under the surface and we're not being curious and if we're not connecting some of these dots, okay, and putting the pieces together to inform our treatment approach, right, we're not being as effective as we can be. Okay. I make a note here with an asterisk. Trauma may be passed through genetic damage and prenatal malnutrition. This is developmental components, how our brain develops, how our gut-to-brain connection develops. And again, really, really interesting areas of research that we'll learn more and more about as we progress in our areas of study. So I went over this sort of case study here, and again, reviewing how the family system background and the personality makeup informs our treatment process. So to connect all of these dots, right, sort of break it down because it is a lot of information, we want to be aware of interconnection and interplay, okay? And we want to be aware of how that can occur within different systems, and that can occur on levels ranging from genetics, heredity, behavior, emotional response, how we connect with one another. As we gain clarity on family system understandings and personality presentations, okay, we're going to use that to inform our treatment modality. So again, using the, right, maybe not using DBT for our antisocial. We are using DBT for our borderline or for folks that are having a tough time with emotional regulation or interpersonal connection, right? Maybe not so much for the antisocial. There are a tremendous amount of great modalities out there, and there are a tremendous amount of wonderful clinicians that do phenomenal training. So, right, you do training in DBT or EMDR, right? And you have a set of tools that's easily accessible and can be integrated into a therapeutic approach. Some other modalities that I'm partial to, psychodynamic, existential, and relational. I think it's cliche but important not to move away from the relevance and the importance of rapport development and developing a connection and a therapeutic alliance with a client or family. Generally speaking, going to get you a bit further in the process, not always a guarantee, and you need to be especially mindful when you're working with family systems of boundary issues, and that people are going to have a lot of different motivations for why they're showing up to do some of the work, and it might not always be everyone's best intentions are in mind when you're doing that work, consciously or not, especially with families. And that's why I think, I wrap up all of this underlining the importance of professional collaboration. And if you're not able to work with a team in a organizational or treatment setting, making sure to do that for yourself and collaborate on cases, speak to your colleagues. If you don't, if you don't have a release of information, you can always collaborate on different modalities, different ideas, different approaches to treatment or interventions. Always be sort of connecting with others in the field to keep you grounded. When you're working with some of the personality stuff, and it is connected to those intergenerational themes, it can become dense very, very quickly. So be sure to have your own support system in place and ready to go so that you're taking care of yourself and your quality of care for the folks that you're working with is as good as it can be. Let's see here. So with that, that does bring me to the end of my presentation. And we can now go into our Q&A session. It looks like our first question here is, can you review the different types of trauma? Yes, absolutely. So very, very good question. A lot of this is going to depend on sort of subjective clinical understanding. I think it's going to depend on different trainings and orientations that clinicians come out of. But generally speaking, I break that down into 3 categories. We have acute trauma, which is our car crash example, chronic trauma, which I understand is basically a series of acute traumatic experiences. That's where we're looking at something like domestic violence as an example, and complex trauma, where we're having some of the more implicit and embedded interpersonal issues showing up in family systems. We're talking about boundary violations. We're talking about somebody that is activated or traumatized and does not have access to a support system, for example. Let's see here. Question 2. How rigidly should we take the criteria for personality disorders or diagnoses? The DSM gives a very sort of clear-cut set of criteria for diagnosis. I think there's a large degree of interpretation within the criteria that's given. Again, I think the reality is the assessment process should always be going on. And the way that somebody's presenting the first month of treatment or the first month of outpatient therapy may be very, very different than how they are month 2 or month 3. So I would continue that assessment process for as long as you're working with somebody, and I would draw on some of that personality disordered criteria primarily to inform our treatment process. But I think that's the job of the clinician, and also good collaborative teamwork to really fine-tune a direction or an understanding for kind of what's going on with a person or a family system. What modalities are most effective in treatment of personality disorders and specific co-occurring issues? Yeah, I mean, great question. And again, we're gonna have to go through a few different factors. So if you're in a treatment setting and your work or an organization, what's the clinical approach or what's the clinical philosophy for that organization, right? So that's going to be one step. The other step is individually, how were you trained? What modalities do you feel most competent in? What modalities do you feel that you can most responsibly practice to support an individual or a family? And 3, what areas of study have you included, or what modalities have you practiced that you feel can be effectively integrated to more specifically meet an individual or family system's needs? So that's where we are drawing from maybe elements of DBT, or maybe we are integrating some EMDR into our individual trauma work. Both of those are phenomenal modalities, and definitely can be integrated effectively based on what you're treating. So again, you want to be mindful of what is it that I'm treating, what is the goal of my treatment efforts, and then putting your intervention and your modality in place based on that. It is generally going to be helpful in terms of efficacy of treatment. Let's see, I hope that answers that question. And then let's see, how do you involve an entire family or work with resistance in a system? That's a great question. So, I think relatively quickly, you may be able to get a feel for how motivated or how resistant the system is. I think whenever you're talking about personality features or disorders, it's inevitable that there's going to be resistance, because the personality stuff is egosyntonic. Like the personality disorder doesn't recognize that it's a problem. Everybody else recognizes it's a problem, but the person that is dealing with it. So you're inevitably going to run into resistance. Resistance is going to look different depending on the personality features. So the avoidant is going to yes you to everything, but they're going to do that to inhibit your ability to get to anything deeper. So they're going to do everything that you ask. They're going to, maybe they're going to be on time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but they're doing that to stay away from, a problem. Because if we get to a problem, then we're going to begin to talk more about where does that come from. And then we're going to have to talk about some stuff underneath the surface. So it might be really, really nice and kind of easy on the surface to work with an avoidant or a dependent system, but it also sets you up for this kind of passive resistance where nobody's explicitly acting out in the system, but you're also not getting where you want to be. So that can be some of the most difficult work that shows up for a person in a clinical setting. And again, it depends. I think the relationship is important as much as one can be developed. And you have to be mindful that you're working with some folks that that work very hard to stay away from developing any kind of relationship. So we need to be mindful of that. But if we can develop some rapport, we're definitely going to get further in our treatment efforts. And, sometimes if somebody is clearly undermining the process, then maybe, call a spade a spade. And maybe you are able to develop an ally within the family system. And maybe somebody in the family, maybe you're able to support somebody in the family system, course correcting within the family system, right? So you don't want it to be entirely the responsibility of the clinician, to course correct the family. You want to support the family in doing its own course correction. So maybe you work to align or support or empower an individual to do some of that work, because it's going to be more effective ultimately if it's coming from the family. If it's coming from within the system, it's going to be more lasting and more effective. Sometimes you may have to ask certain people to not participate in treatment. That's an option as well. I mean, you can always very, very clearly, I believe, say this is not helpful. The goal of what our work is to support and to help and to heal. And if somebody's not on board with that, then we can very clearly share that. And I think that's a part of our responsibility to a certain degree as well. So I hope that helps. You could definitely go on and on with all those questions for sure. But thank you for sending those in. And that concludes our presentation for the day. Thank you all so much. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.